So you drove down yesterday?
Yeah, yesterday afternoon.
So do you live in Klamath, or where do you live at?
Yep.
Just born and bred?
Nope. Born outside of Seattle. Moved to Eugene, Oregon in the middle of high school, and then from there went all across the country playing baseball in college.
Nice.
And then
what position you play?
I was a pitcher.
Oh, very nice.
So, but after that, I started my career in water and kind of worked my way all around Oregon, starting up in Pendleton, and then moved down to the lower John Day Basin, Condon, Fossil area, and then ended up in Klamath Falls in 2011.
So when you said started a career in water, what does that mean?
Well, I started with the Oregon Water Resources Department. I can't even remember the year now, but it was I was a well inspector. So started in groundwater and worked my way into a water master position regulating water on the lower John Day Basin, and then took a lateral transfer down to Klamath because it seemed exciting, just because of the water issues going on there. And exciting is really an understatement, to be frank, but that's really kind of how my career unfolded.
What's your education background? Is it
environmental science is my undergrad, and I also have an MBA.
Okay,
nice. Yeah. Well, I'd like to formally, invite everybody that's listening in to know who we're talking to. So across the table from me, we have Scott with KDD, Klamath Drainage District. And then next to him is Mark Hennelly, CWA, of course, been on this podcast before. And to the left is Jeff Smith, my other co-host. So we're going to be touching on all sorts of topics today that involve water, Klamath, the whole state, and kind of where we're at. So let's just say current time, what are we looking at in, as far as KDD is concerned, in the Klamath Basin? What are we looking at?
Well, currently, in the last couple of weeks, we've gone from 35% snowpack up to 90. I think the highest we hit was 96% snowpack. As of this morning when I looked, we're back down to 85. But it is looking like we got some precip out on the forecast coming. So keeping our fingers crossed, that keeps coming, keeps filling up our lake. I think the real interesting thing about what's coming up in 2024 is what, and I don't know the answer to this, but what does this look like with dam removal?
Yeah.
As you all, or as most I think know, 4 dams on the Klamath River were blown in the last few weeks, and so now we have a live connected river again, with the exception of 2, Link River Dam, which is the dam that holds up Upper Klamath Lake, and then Keno Dam, which holds what's considered Lake Awana right there, just outside of Klamath Falls, in between Keno and Klamath Falls. So that being said, there is ESA consultation ongoing today, and we're not quite sure how that's going to work out, but we are engaged in those conversations. And trying to put a model together, if you will, that will work for a new river system, and obviously all legs of the stool that need water, being the species, both the sucker and the coho in the river, and then as well as the contractors, which are the water users.
Do we have any ideas of how the dam removals are going to affect the waters, or it's still just completely up in the air, no guesses, or do we have a direction that they're going?
Well, I think people have an idea. I think if there wasn't an idea, it would never have happened, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the hope is that it will improve the water quality, which in turn will increase the overall beneficial habitat for these species that are threatened. And I would say all salmon. I mean, we want all the fish to do better as a result, because really, as one of my board members likes to say, the fish have our water and we want it back. And so if we start seeing actual recovery in these species, then we should start seeing the benefit. And frankly, that's what we've been told all along as water users is once these dams come out, we should be in a better position, because it will require less water in the river, therefore more water coming back to the water users.
So potentially some of these species could be delisted if that's a success, right?
I think that's ultimately the goal. The unfortunate thing about the ESA is it's not intended to recover species. It's intended to I can't remember the exact language that it's written as, but it's basically written in a way to where you can't further jeopardize the species, not necessarily recovery. So recovery has to be another effort outside of ESA consultations. So the benefit is, I think all parties right now are wanting to talk recovery, and so recovery is actually it's quite the topic right now, especially with all the money that's being thrown around at the federal level. You know, people are really talking about what can we do with this money to actually start restoring the basin for the benefit of these species. And I think the beauty of that is it's not just necessarily restoring the basin for the species, it's restoring the basin for all parties, really. I mean, when you think about restoration, I mean, there's very, very few, or there's very many parties, that benefit, not just fish. I think you've got, you know, water users that are going to benefit, birds are going to benefit, especially when we're talking about restoration activities down on the refuges. So I think just a healthy ecosystem means a healthy basin, means a healthy society. So that's just my own personal opinion. But it seems to be like we're going in that direction, which is, it's nice. It's fun to talk about.
Yeah. Do we have a plan? I know Replumb the Klamath has kind of come up. What does that entail?
Yeah, that's a concept that we started throwing together in conversations with Refuge folks, as well as some other parties. To date, there's a handful of us that are coming together and starting to try and put together what that might look like, and taking concept to hopefully reality. What that means, though, is we have Klamath Drainage District has 2 points of diversion off of the Klamath River. One is the North Canal, one is the 80 Canal. What we're proposing in this concept is to connect the 80 Canal from the river to Unit 2 in Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. So now what we're looking at is basically Unit 2 becomes a live arm, if you will, of Lower Klamath Lake and what it used to be. And so right now what we're looking at is the feasibility of it. Elevation-wise, obviously there's some major roadways along there, and some other infrastructure that we really have to look at and see if we can even pull something like this off. But we've got money coming in. I heard we've got $1.8 million coming in April, if I'm not mistaken, to help us continue with the feasibility. We've already got LiDAR flown, or fresh LiDAR, so we're going to be looking at real up-to-date elevation stuff to see, you know, what an inundation map might look like and things like that. So that concept really should start taking shape here in the very near future. But we're talking about other things just in addition to the connection. I mean, we're looking at our private lands and seeing what we can do potentially, if the price is right for our landowners, to kind of treat those as some of the floodplain type activity stuff along the canal, maybe even elsewhere, where if it makes sense, to where, you know, kind of mimic some of the stuff we're doing down here in the rice fields, you know, and growing fish food, if you will, or even potentially having fish habitat out on our private grounds. So we're exploring all those options and seeing what we can put together.
And of course, having Unit 2 flooded on like a semi-permanent or permanent basis, that would provide a huge benefit for our local ducks in terms of not just breeding, but molting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that spring and summer water to me is one of the most important things that we can do to try to make things right up there at the refuge, because a lot of our local mallards really depend on that water. And, you know, when Unit 2 is wet, it is very productive. A lot of birds can be bred off of there. So to me, this is great news. I mean, if they're able to eventually do it, I think it's going to really benefit us.
Yeah.
For the people that aren't super familiar with Klamath, can you kind of describe, when you're talking about Unit 2, where it is on the refuge opposed to like the sump and everything?
Sure.
Like that?
Yeah. So it's right there off of the state line highway, right as you come in from the west as you're traveling towards Tule Lake, and it straddles the California-Oregon border. And when we do get water for Lower Klamath, typically that's the first unit that you get water into. It's the main sanctuary unit. Yeah. It's a very large unit,
right
too.
there on the road.
I think it's over 1,000 acres, right, Scott?
Oh, yeah.
It's got to be at least that. Yeah.
Yeah, if not double.
Yeah, but it's a great, not only a good area to breed birds, to have molting habitat, but just to hold birds generally. So you have that flooded up, if there's hunting around that area, it definitely tends to benefit from the birds that are held there.
Yeah, and for the most recent history, it's been basically dry for the most part.
Other than the small amounts of water that we've gotten in there over the last few years.
Yep. Yeah, and I know just driving up there, that unit's, the way we always came in was the first thing that you kind of saw, and it was like, oh, wow, a lot of birds here. It was always kind of an eye-popping moment. So to go up there and to see that, dry in the wintertime is pretty sad, actually. But
Yeah, I remember being up there, junior hunts and stuff, and coming back across state line and those birds hopping out of two and going to the grain fields, just black with birds. And same thing, you go up there now and there's like a coot in the ditch and a little tiny piece of water that's still left there. It's like, what happened?
Yep.
But obviously we're working our way, back to as much as it could be potentially back to what it was.
Well, I would just add to that and saying that 2 years ago, I think it was the first year that the Refuge closed hunting out there on Lower Klamath and Tule Lake. And that just can't happen. That can't happen. I mean, to actually be a water manager in the Klamath Basin for the first time in history that they close hunting on the refuges doesn't feel very good. That's not something you want to put on your resume.
Yeah.
And so knowing that we're planning to hopefully avoid that ever happening again, I mean, that's something you get to go home and you fall asleep to pretty easily, knowing that you're working on that kind of stuff. And we're not the only one. I shouldn't say that. There's a handful of people, and it's really exciting to get people around the table talking about how to never let that happen again.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I kind of have, and maybe it's a devil's advocate question, is just like, CWA has their own thing. We want to purchase water rights and get water there. KDD sounds like, you want to do the replumb and getting, so where is the mutual ground achieved between these organizations? Or is there, everybody's kind of going to go try to do their own thing to achieve the same goal that everybody's going after? Like is there cross lines communication with you guys and CWA and Ducks Unlimited? Or is it all, hey, we're going to try to do it this way and we're going to try to do it this way, and then whoever does it, hooray?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but what I can tell you is my sense is a lot of people are really starting to focus in on the ecosystem as a whole. And so when you focus in on the ecosystem, really there's no wrong answer. You're focused on what the right thing to do is. And the right thing to do is going to benefit, whether we're looking at fish, the consequence of focusing on fish on the refuge is it's good for the birds too, right? It's good for the water users who are trying to grow stuff just up north and keeping the birds down there so they're not devastating our crops as they're trying to grow. There's mutual benefits when we start looking at groundwater inputs, and the recharge that we're seeing it firsthand over in Tule Lake. Subsidence starting to occur. I mean, that's a scary thing to witness, and so when we're starting to talk about an ecosystem, it's doing the right thing, and the consequences as a result are all positive, at least when I'm looking at this. So the beauty of that is really people who have been really focused on one thing are starting to look at the big picture, and as a result, we're all kind of coming around the same table looking like, hey, this benefits me, this benefits you and you and you and you. Mm-hmm. So it's a cool moment we're living in, and really I tell folks this occasionally, like, I'm not sure if we're here if those refuges didn't go dry. I'm not sure if we're here if they did cancel or didn't cancel hunting, because those types of things, although they're hard to say, they're hard to witness, I'm seeing good come from that, and I'm hoping that good lasts at least for my entire career and hopefully beyond, through my grandkids. So anyway, I'll pause there.
Yeah. And I would say the main, thing that we've been partnering with KDD on, and I can't thank Scott and KDD enough, is this agricultural drain water that they typically have in February and March, and making that available to the refuge. I mean, that's been a huge shot in the arm. We've talked before about our water rights acquisition and some other things that we've done, but having that water then there in March and then into April as kind of a basis for Unit 2 to kind of be flooded up, that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the spring and summer. So what they have done essentially is provided some breeding and molting habitat over on the lower Klamath side. And really, that's the only habitat over there. I mean, the rest of the refuge is basically dry. So if it wasn't from their, because of their efforts, if we did not have them doing this, we would essentially have a dry refuge.
Yeah, and I know for the first little bit of this conversation, we've talked about, hey, this is how we're going to fix it, and this is what's going on. Let's take a step back and talk about how did we get ourselves in this position? Because, we've just discussed all of our plans for the future to get it back, but what happened?
Let me see if I can do this without without pointing fingers too sternly at anybody. I mentioned the Endangered Species Act, and I'll take everybody back to 2001. And 2001 was a year where we had two biological opinions, one for sucker, one for coho. They competed with each other, and they butt heads. And a judge actually finally ruled on this thing that there is not enough water for everybody, and you guys need to split it between suckers and coho, and there is nothing for water users, period. So that was the first year in history there was no water for the Klamath Reclamation Project. It was shut down. Eventually, I think it was in the month of July, a little bit of water, but by then it's too late, right? I mean, everybody who's trying to start can't start on time. We have a very limited growing season up there. And so it was too late. But that was when, we got a lot of national attention. There was media out there. It was all over the country what was going on there. The famous Bucket Brigade, right? Yep. I would say, there were some things that led up to that moment, but that was really the start of kind of highlighting the issues that are going on. So one good thing that came from that is that the two competing biological opinions in the United States Wisdom said, why don't we do a joint biological opinion? Let's bring NOAA Marine Fisheries in with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Reclamation and talk about how do we do this all under one document. Well, that's technically not accurate. It's still multiple documents, but they started working together. But unfortunately, as a result, and it didn't help that we started moving into a drier climate. As a result, science, quote unquote, best available science, started pointing that more water was needed in the river, higher lake elevations in the lake. As a result, we already know what growers need for growing stuff, but it's, our crops are not on the endangered species list. So as a result, just less and less water was coming out to the project. And when I say the Klamath Reclamation Project, that includes the refuge. The refuges are part of the Klamath Reclamation Project. They have water rights just the way that, everybody does out on the project. They just don't have contracts with the Bureau of Reclamation. So they've always kind of been viewed as kind of last in line to get water. And so getting into this drier climate that's less and less water going out into the Klamath Reclamation Project to maintain lake elevations and maintain river flows. And, being drought after drought after drought the way we've been having, unfortunately, the refuge just wasn't getting anything. Mm-hmm. And, as we all saw in the last couple of years, we saw dry mud flats, as a result. So it's just it's a compounding effects over time, and we just finally hit hopefully rock bottom, and we're starting to crawl our way back out.
I'll just add to that. Another thing that really affected the amount of water, at least over on the lower Klamath side, was there was a power compact that expired. And so the electrical rates went way up. And so, of course, a big part of getting water over the lower Klamath side is pumping through deep plant through the hill, right? And so, there also has been less water going over to the Tule Lake side over time as well. So that's definitely, been a problem. But just the, expensive cost of pumping through the hill has really then created a disincentive then to flood the lower Klamath side up. So, Yeah, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of different factors that have kind of all combined in a nasty way to create the situation that we have today.
That's a really good point. You say that we become more efficient because those power rates have increased the way they have, but in reality, the system hasn't become more efficient because the project its efficiency was ran on reusing that water. Well, you got a pump to reuse that water. I mean, there's reports out there that say we use water 3.5 times within the Klamath Reclamation Project, and that includes going through the refuge and its uses that occurred out on the refuge. But when you raise your power rates like that, we actually become less efficient because now we've got growers on farm saying, well, I gotta be more efficient on farm, which means we don't get the returns. And then you've got districts like mine as an example, and Tule Lake, we got to get more efficient on districts so we don't have to use these massive pumps. So we put in recirculation pumping plants to be able to reuse our water on the district instead of using those massive pumps to get them back out to the river because it costs more money to get it out to the river. So as a result, there's less water getting into the river, which means there's more water being used out of Upper Klamath Lake to meet river flows. So as a result, it's a net loss to the system in terms of water efficiency, and we're doing it to be power efficient, which is really kind of it's a catch-22. I mean, we're just forced into that situation because of higher power rates, which is unfortunate. The whole system suffers as a result.
Yeah.
Now, with the increase of the river flows and the higher elevations of the lakes, have those species benefited in a positive way?
I'm going to say no.
Yeah.
The data, and that's just factual, the data does not suggest that there's any recovery going on. There are certain years where you see, recruitment occurring and things like that, especially in your salmonids in the river. I think those are conditions that are just occurring naturally. But data-wise, it's not suggesting that more water actually equals more fish at this point. That's my opinion. I'm sure somebody, if there was a phone line, would call in right now and call and argue with me on that. From what I read and how I understand it, I don't see it.
Yeah.
Now, is there hope on the horizon? Absolutely. I think that if what everybody's saying, or the biologists are saying that dams coming out is going to improve water quality, which means less habitat's going to be required. Temperatures should be cooler in the river, which is really good for curbing the sea Shasta disease that's in the river. If all of that starts occurring, then yeah, we should start seeing better recruitment in our salmonids. I think from a sucker perspective, I don't know if anybody really knows what's going on there.
Yeah.
But the beauty of the suckers is we're now utilizing the refuges again as home to the suckers. We've actually got suckers out on Lower Klamath now, which there are traditional spawning streams on Lower Klamath for suckers. So, fingers crossed we start seeing some recovery going on with the suckers down there on the refuge. Because I think Upper Klamath Lake is just a massive black hole. We don't know what's going on. These fish, they grow up to a certain age and they disappear. And so, eventually, these mature sucker, they're going to die off, and so, it's scary to think about, but it's, I'm optimistic that the refuges are there to kind of hang on to that species for a while until we get that figured out up there.
With all the dam removals, does much change on Upper Lake in terms of depth and all that? Is the lake going to stay essentially the same it is now, or will it go down or up? Or
that's a good question. There's as I noted earlier, ESA consultation's ongoing right now, and there's been proposals out there to look at lake elevations. The right answer is I don't know at this point. There has not been a proposed action written by the Bureau of Reclamation yet, or biological opinions in response. It's being looked at. River flows are being looked at. Refuges are being looked at. Basically, everybody who needs water wants water. All of it's being looked at.
Yeah.
And so I don't know is the right answer right now.
Is there a rough timeline on any of this with, in your mind, in your professional opinion, it's like, what's 5 years now, 10 years now, 20 years now? What's the timeline of like, hey, this might actually happen? And I know now we're in the part where everybody's kind of figuring out, we're, communicating with each other, suckerfish, this and that. But in your opinion, dealing with water, what's the timeline where it's like, hey, Unit 2 now is going to be full, and it's going to be full for the foreseeable future, and we're working now to get water further into the refuge. But what's a feasible?
Well, as I noted, we got 1.8 million to continue our feasibility on this. My hope or my push would be to have that done by the end of the year.
Oh, wow.
And have an actual plan on paper and really starting to lobby for the implementation funds to get that going. We've partnered with, many, Yurok tribe, namely, who is really active. The Klamath tribes are very much supportive of this concept, as well as Modoc Nation, who they've bought a ranch now on the southeast end of Lower Klamath Refuge, which is exciting. I mean, that's their homeland. They want to see water down there again, and so having them as a neighbor has been a really, really good thing for our neighborhood, if you will.
Yeah.
And so having those folks in our camp and pushing to get this done has been a real blessing. And so I have all the confidence in the world that we'll be able to push this across the finish line so long as the feasibility pans out and it does work. And that's a key thing. We need to make sure that this is going to work to begin with.
What's the biggest worry of yours that's not going to work?
I think just elevation. I mean, Now hypothetically, let's say the river level is above State Line Road. Well, what are we looking to do there? Are we looking to raise the road? Are we going to build a bridge? What are we going to do? And so when you start thinking like that, you start thinking about implementation dollars and, oh my goodness, can we afford this? Should we do this? And so I think that's in my mind some of our biggest obstacles is just infrastructure that may be in the way.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
So everybody hears, water in Klamath, Tule Lake, this, that. Is there other areas of the state that have other water issues that people should be aware of, or at least, on the radar?
Yeah, I mean, I would say water, when it comes to obviously waterfowl habitat in California, it's the biggest issue out there. There's just now so much competition for available supplies, and of course regulations now related to endangered species. As much as we have endangered species issues down in the Klamath Basin, we also have them throughout the rest of California as well. So that's something that's going to be there for a long, long time. So yeah, a few issues I would say that are really important in other parts of the state. One would be probably some of folks have heard about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And so that was passed, I think, back in 2014 by our state legislature and signed into law. That basically focuses on overdrafted groundwater basins and requires that those basins, be sustainably managed. And in order to do that, then it puts restrictions on the amount of groundwater that you can pump, as well as associated fees. And so that's all starting to be implemented now. I think the goal is to have it fully implemented in 2040. But we're already seeing duck clubs down in the Tulare Basin and even in the East Grasslands where you do have some overdraft, basically saying, hey, in a few years, I'm not going to be able to flood my duck club anymore. I'm not going to be able to do this because the pumping restrictions are too harsh and I can't pay all the associated fees. So it could really, in the long term, result in a major loss of wetlands in certain parts of the state. So that's a worry.
Yeah, huge worry.
The good thing is we have a bill that we're working on with some of our other waterfowl partners. It's in the state legislature right now. It's AB 828. And that would provide an exemption for managed wetlands from, it's called SIGMA, is the acronym for the Groundwater Management Act. And essentially managed wetlands would be able to be exempted from any of the pumping restrictions, and they also would not have to pay the fees.
Oh, wow.
It's only would be in place for about a 3-year period. Our hope is that if we could get the bill through the legislature, get it signed into law, then work, on trying to make it permanent in the future. But at least it would provide some temporary relief for these clubs, and not only affects clubs, but also even state wildlife areas. If they're in an overdrafted basin, they would be impacted as well. So the only real wetlands that are not impacted by SGMA would be those owned by the federal government, so a national wildlife refuge.
So like Kern Refuge would be
They would be exempt from it. But the bill right now, it's actually pending on the assembly floor, and we're supposed to have a vote on it today.
Oh, wow.
So hopefully it'll get over
soon. We'll know.
Yeah, over to the state. Then it'll go to the state Senate, have to go through that same process, and then it would go to the governor.
Are we feeling confident on that, or?
There's a little bit of opposition from some of the other groups that are affected by SGMA, including some farm groups. It's like, if we're going to get an exemption, why shouldn't they get an exemption? So I understand that. Although the wetlands are really a small, very small portion of all the groundwater used. And of course, wetlands too have a lot of recharge benefits, right? Because we're flooding up in late fall and into winter when you get that recharge going. So it's a little bit apples to orange, but we're sensitive, obviously, to any kind of impact on agriculture. We'll just see how it goes, and hopefully we can get it done. We'll know by, probably late September, early October, whether it made it or not.
Where's the cutoff line, like in terms of location of the state, where that does not, let's call it, Butte County is out of that, opposed to Kern County? I mean, where in the state does that end for SGMA? Well,
in terms of each basin, they look at it, whether it's overdraft or not, and, what its groundwater challenges are. So Sacramento Valley, as you know, is in pretty good shape as it pertains to groundwater.
So we're just talking about the Tulare Basin then?
Yeah. So the main ones that have come up so far, Tulare Basin, East Grasslands, and then also up in, it's northeastern California, it'd be Siskiyou County, around like Butte Valley Wildlife Area.
Yeah.
So they're going through a lot of SGMA work right now, and that's another area that we want to make sure that, like Butte Valley Wildlife Area, Shasta Valley, that they stay whole.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important also to get this bill through to protect them.
Got it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to hear about that, because on the forefront is Klamath Tule Lake, but there's other water issues through the states that people should probably be aware of, because, like you said, in the next future years, it could be affecting a lot of people's huntings, and they have no clue about it at this point.
Yeah. So I'll mention a couple others. A lot of folks know about the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. We would love a similar act up in the Klamath Basin, but of course that never happened. But that helps to ensure water supplies for refuges and then duck clubs down in the Merced County in the grasslands, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very critical component to wetland conservation in California. Well, there are some folks in Washington, D.C. that want to gut that program. And unfortunately, there's a bill by Congressman David Valadao, he represents the San Joaquin Valley, that just passed the House of Representatives a couple months ago, that essentially will gut the CVPIA. And it basically, the legislation deems it complete. So no longer would the federal government have to mitigate for the impacts of the Central Valley Project. So if that were then to pass the Senate and be signed into law, which right now I do not think is likely given the political dynamics at play, that would be a devastating loss to what we do here in California in terms of our waterfowl conservation efforts and hunting opportunity as well. I mean, all of these refuges, they pump groundwater as well. The groundwater only goes so far. You can't rely on that wholly for your supplies. So we got to make sure that this bill dies a death here soon. We'll see with the elections coming up. After this fall, we may have a totally new dynamic in D.C. We're just afraid that if the dynamics change enough, that could give this kind of legislation more legs. So we're watching it very closely, and we'll be back in Washington, D.C. the first week of March, lobbying heavily against it. So, we're going to have to definitely step up our efforts in D.C. to make sure that bill, doesn't move. And then I'll give you an example here of where too much water can be problematic. So sometimes that's the case, particularly when you get endangered species, involved with the management of water supplies. So everybody's familiar, of course, with the Yolo Basin. We have the Yolo Wildlife Area there, which is a huge public hunting program. We also have a number of duck clubs there. There is a project that's been ongoing to put a notch in the Fremont Weir, and that would allow the state to flood the Yolo bypass for longer durations and at a deeper elevation than what it currently is operated as. And this, frankly, is going to, basically put Yolo Wildlife Area underwater for much longer periods of time. The duck clubs down in that area too are going to be inundated. Probably half of their season is going to be lost if they operate this weir in a new way that is again trying to. It's the whole purpose of it is to increase habitat for fish, for salmon, right? So they have more places for their young fry to go to stock up on resources. Those floodplains are very good for fish, and we recognize that. But unfortunately, this is a case of a salmon project that could really hurt waterfowl. And so it's all going to be about how they operate that weir. And we've been just trying to provide our input that, hey, it needs to be operated in such a way that it has minimum impact on not only the wildlife area, but those duck clubs. So we'll see, in the future how this works out. As you guys also know, when that bypass floods, it just becomes a huge attractant for a lot of waterfowl that just sit there and aren't really disturbed. I mean, there's a few guys that go out in boats and hunt that area, but therefore it could also affect, the hunting throughout that entire region. If we get a massive raft of birds out there that nobody can really get to, that's going to take birds away from other areas that are not flooded.
What's the timeline on that project for potential for it to be full effect?
It was supposed to be in effect for this year, and for some reason they delayed it. But I think starting next year, it will be in effect. There are some lawsuits. So the state has gone in and tried to condemn some of the duck clubs to essentially, ensure that the state has the right to put this amount of water on them. And that's going through eminent domain proceedings. So that may possibly slow down some things, but from what I'm hearing, it's probably going to be next fall that it will be operational. Yeah.
Wasn't the notch originally supposed to be a little bit smaller, and then it's a lot bigger?
All of these ideas start out
somebody
small.
got a little excited.
At first you hear about these, proposals, and they don't sound so bad, but then they morph into something a lot worse.
Right.
So you got to really stay on top of them. But that's the nature of our government, right?
Yeah.
This wouldn't be the first time.
Well, you feel terrible for the public duck hunter, but some of those private duck clubs that you're talking about, there's a lot of money invested in those clubs
Absolutely.
that are essentially useless overnight if you cannot use a recreation property during the time of recreation. So a huge financial loss as well, where those guys historically you get flooded out, but I mean you're not flooded out for 2.5 months of duck season.
Yeah. And many of them have state and federal conservation easements on them.
There's that,
You
right?
would think
Which makes no sense
that
in my
would
brain.
preclude them from ever going forward with this project, but unfortunately the easements are enough to block it. And so then I think too of all the money the state and the federal governments have spent trying to put high quality waterfowl habitat on these areas, and now they're going to flood them 8 feet high. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. But again, that's our government, right?
Yeah.
They do some interesting things, and I don't think there's always a lot of thought involved with some of these things as to what the implications long term may be.
How has the winter up in the basin been this year compared to previous? Because I know down here we've been dry in the last couple of weeks. some of our properties are underwater right now. So what are you guys seeing up there for your winter?
Same thing. We started off real slow. Gosh, I would say, actually, I might have mentioned this earlier. We went from 35% snowpack, and then over the course of 2 weeks, jumped up to 95, 96%, something like that. So didn't have a whole lot of storms out of the gate. Real warm. I was golfing a lot into the early winter. But we had some really good storms. The snow's almost gone now in my backyard. But yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. We haven't had the real cold like we typically get either. Even when that cold front came down, it didn't come down to Klamath. We were still in the 40s when, it was in the 20s and the teens up there and just north of us in Oregon. So it just came down right to us and didn't quite get to us. So it's been different for sure. How it is comparatively, I don't know. As long as I've lived in Klamath, I mean, you hear the old timers talk about, the snow banks and stuff like that. And, people complain on social media about, not getting the snow off the roads. And then people come back and be like, you have no idea what snow is, So, if you listen to the old timers, it's definitely not the same. But in my experience, it's kind of hit or miss. I think we've had a couple of really good snow years since I've lived there. But it's generally you get a snow and then it melts off and you get another snow and it melts off. And, just so long as it's accumulating up in the mountains. The sad thing is you drive across the pass right now and it's just, it's disappearing pretty quick.
Yeah.
So
how much does the snowpack up there affect your guys' water availability? Because here, I mean, where we hunt in rice country, that's all it is if you have water in the reservoirs, everybody gets water for their rice. And obviously you're not doing the complete same up there, but how much does that have an impact on the season going forward?
It can a lot in terms of sustainability on Upper Klamath Lake. I mean, we need that snowpack up there in order for our stream flows into Upper Klamath Lake to maintain elevations. Otherwise, the lake just plummets, So the interesting thing about our basin is we kind of have two different sides. We've got the Cascade Mountains to our west, so we're definitely looking at snowpack there because there's streams that come into Upper Klamath Lake there. But to our east, we've got the Sprague and Williamson systems, which are generally drier systems. So when I personally am watching the snowpack, I'm pinpointing those locations further east because those are some of our biggest drivers in terms of understanding what our water year is going to look like or our inflows into Upper Klamath Lake are going to look like. Because generally the Cascade streams, they're short-lived and boom, they're gone. But if we get a good snowpack out east, our Williamson River inputs are gonna stay higher and hopefully help the lake out in the long term.
In a year like last year where we were just inundated with snow and rain all year down here, did you guys get any of those storms? Was it a good, winter for you guys?
I would say it was a better winter and it was an even better spring.
Okay.
We ended up getting, I think, up to 200% snowpack last year, but it all came late in the spring and then it just rained, which is good and bad. I mean, it's good from a water management perspective. It's bad from a grower's perspective, because, it came at the time when everybody's chomping at the bit to get out in the fields and get to farming. And so there's pros and cons to that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was a good water year, and surprisingly, under the ESA rules, or what we're living under is the interim operations plan right now, we didn't even get a full supply of water. So it's a broken system, and we just need to figure out how to fix it.
And for the folks that have never hunted up there or been up in that area, I mean, when we talk about agriculture, what are the crops? What is the main focus of the ag in that area?
I'll start with my district. My district is primarily a grain district, various grains depending on the market, I would say. But over the years, we've started transitioning into more row crops. We're growing potatoes. There's alfalfa coming in. We've actually transitioned from a lot of pasture over to alfalfa recently. I'll say pasture and grains into alfalfa. mint has been growing out there, although I don't think there's any coming up, and I don't think there was any last year. I think I said potatoes. Did I say potatoes? You get off of my district, and pasture. You get off of my district, and you'll find onions, garlic, obviously more pasture and alfalfa, horseradish. I'm sure there's others that I'm missing.
Yeah.
We do have some that are growing the lettuces and things like that up there. But that's about it. I mentioned earlier we have a very short growing season, so we're real limited in what we can grow. So if they can grow it in the short growing season, I think it's been tried, and so we're kind of where we are. Amazingly, carrots. I'm surprised they don't take off there because they're the best carrots.
Oh, really?
Oh my goodness, they're amazing. I wish we grew more of them, but I don't even know if any were grown last year. But carrots come out real good up there.
From what I've heard from the biologists, something like half of all the food resources coming chiefly from the cereal grains are part of a waterfowl's diet up in the Klamath Basin. So, I mean, if agriculture was ever to go away, it would have a huge devastating impact on the birds and the flyway. And, I mean, they really have very little reason to stop in the Klamath Basin at all. So keeping the farmers whole is so critical. I mean, they're helping not only to get the water to the refuge, but also, providing these food resources that are just critical, both in the fall and then back in the spring when they stage before they go breed.
Yep.
And, the beauty of my district is we are the only district that has year-round water rights. So one of our irrigation practices is we flood our fields up in the fall, winter to improve the soil moisture profile come spring. And then they'll come behind that and plant grain, and the grain typically doesn't even need any irrigation beyond that. It just grows naturally. But the beauty of that is and we were promoting this when they closed down the refuges a couple of years ago, is that KDD, we're the only restaurant in town, because we literally were. We were the only place with water. We were the only place with energy for these birds. And I mean, as a result, it was where all the birders wanted to go. It was where anybody that loves birds, they were hanging out on my district, taking a look at, the ecosystem, if you will, because that's really what was happening. I mean, there was a field we pulled up to one day. We had bald eagles in one corner. We had, sprig out there like crazy, snows, Canada. I don't remember seeing mallards. It wouldn't surprise me if they were out there, though. Sandhill cranes, and on top of that, we had coyotes coming out to see what they could try to drum up. So it was pretty amazing. It was quite a shot.
That's awesome.
And of course, those grain fields, whether they're flooded or just dry, can be phenomenal for hunting. So we talked last time. God, some of the best hunts I've ever had in my life have been in flooded grain fields up there.
Yep.
So definitely, for that reason alone, it's critical. That agriculture continues to provide those opportunities. And I know too, a lot of farmers up there are hunters themselves as well. So I mean, I think a lot of them, they believe in what they're doing because they want to conserve the birds and have that hunting heritage protected in the area, right?
Yeah, I think largely, our growers get a bad rap thinking that they're after one thing, and that's chasing, their crop, and which results in dollars. But I don't know one guy that wouldn't stop when they're harvesting to when they're starting to see pheasant run out, and make sure that they're not chopping any of them up. And, you start talking to some of my growers, especially, and them seeing the condition the refuges are in. I mean, you start seeing tears well up in their eyes. They grew up out there.
Yeah.
So they're used to seeing the skies blackened with birds, and the sound of it. And, I've been finding myself using the term silent spraying a lot, the famous book that Rachel Carson wrote, and I think a lot of these guys are feeling that and witnessing that, compared to their youth, and seeing the way things used to be. It's emotional, it's like seeing your neighborhood kind of just go south, go in the wrong direction. So, they're very passionate. My growers especially are very passionate about the work that we're trying to do right now to start healing these refuges, heal our ecosystem and our neighborhood.
Well, before we sign off today, just kind of give you guys an open mic if you want to touch on anything else that we may have looked over for either of you, Mark or Scott, that you want to let the listeners know beforehand, or if we've covered everything.
I just want to say again, I so appreciate what Scott and KDD do. The Klamath Basin is so critical to what we're doing here at CWA. I mean, if that goes away, it's going to have a massive negative impact on our flyway, and not only in terms of the number of birds that we get coming here, out of Canada and other places up north, but just our local birds again. I don't think we can really fully address our mallard problem, and we do have a mallard problem in our state. I mean, we know that the breeding numbers the last few years have been way off, but we cannot even begin to address that if we don't fix what's going on up in Klamath. Mm-hmm. So if folks want to do everything they can to support, higher mallard populations elsewhere in California, you got to fix what's going on up there. So, yeah. It's a critical area for waterfowl and the birds that, California hunters most want to target.
What can a CWA member do to help the fight? We get that a lot. What can they do to get the word out or make a difference?
Well, certainly when we do, our voter voice alerts, participate in those and contact whoever we're asking them to contact. Those decision makers, they need to hear from these folks. But also, I think just a random call or email to your congressman or even your state legislator would be good. Let them know it's an issue of concern. And that tends to, if enough people do that within a district, that gets attention. Okay. And people, the representatives will be a lot more responsive. For me as a lobbyist to go in and talk with these folks is one thing. But for them to hear from their own constituents, that is much more powerful than anything I could ever provide. So really getting involved with your local district, your local politics is important.
Gotcha. I would echo that. They definitely want to hear from their constituents. To add to that, I would say, if somebody's listening to this and calls their congressman up and says, "Hey, I heard Scott on the podcast, and they need money." They've got a lot of good ideas. They're trying to do a lot of good stuff. Please support getting money, funneling money up there to start doing some of this stuff. And we're not the only ones. I mean, I'll add, in addition to the replumbing piece on the 80 canal, we're also proposing to punch the North Canal across state line also and give the refuge additional opportunities to manage water the way that they see is best for the refuge. So we'll be able to plumb water out to the east side of the refuge and into the P1 lateral out there, hopefully very soon. So that's just one thing. From a reclamation project perspective, there's a real strong push. It's called what are they calling it? It's just a flow-through concept. The flow-through concept is basically to run water through the entire project again, fill up the entire system, and create it in a way like a massive oxbow, if you will. So water's running through the entire project, back through treated wetlands and coming back cleaner than when it went in, and then back into the river. So, that's a massive restoration project that I think that everybody should be getting behind from an ecosystem perspective, a refuge perspective. It helps water users. It helps fish. There's just all kinds of wins on the table there with that concept. So any level of support your membership wants to support in any of the restoration work we're talking about up there would be greatly, greatly appreciated.
Nice. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Your time.
Thank you guys for coming out and talking to us about it, because it does help.
Yeah. So. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Save It for the Blind podcast. You can find our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.